I'm Gavin Beckett. I'm the Chief Enterprise Architect at Bristol City Council. And I'm going to talk you through today how Bristol has been using Alfresco over the last 3 or 4 years, some of the drivers that got us into using Alfresco, but also the big picture of change in local government generally and what that means for us in terms of the kinds of technologies we need to use to support the new kinds of organisations, the new kind of services that we need to provide. I think it's quite important that we contextualise the value of something like Alfresco in that picture, much as Doug Dunline was talking this morning about the fact that all of us as Alfresco customers are doing different things with it. We're using it to deliver some kind of value to either customers or, in our case, citizens, residents, businesses in the city of Bristol. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason for doing that, and we actually need to remember what that is and understand how that makes the choice of Alfresco relevant for Bristol. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through 5 things. First of all, a kind of high-level, kind of helicopter view context, strategic context of local government in Bristol and the challenges that we're facing. And then I'm going to drill into 2 of those in a little bit more detail. I'm going to talk about digital services in local government and what that means and how document services are necessary in that sphere. And then I'm also going to talk about Agile working, which you might also think of as flexible working or in local government. So that's around how our staff work inside the organisation and the changes that are happening there and how, again, document management and document services are important in that change. And then I'll get on to a bit about specifically Alfresco. So how did we choose Alfresco? How have we implemented it to support those kind of themes in the organisation? And then I'll finish on a few challenges because, with everything that we do, and especially when we're dealing with some of the complex issues in local government that we have to deal with, there are challenges. So a few things there. Okay, so I'll dive into the context. So the big picture of local government change. Well, I suppose the first thing to say is Bristol does have a lot of strengths. So before I get on to the challenges, I just reflect on some of the things that are great about Bristol. We have a very vibrant cultural and creative sector. We have actually the fastest growing economy, recovering economy outside London since the recession. And we have strengths in financial services, we have strengths in high-tech, digital media and engineering. And we have also 2 very strong universities in Bristol, and they have particular strengths around, again, science, engineering, technology. And that really draws on a tradition in Bristol of several hundred years of innovation, technical leadership, engineering leadership from Brunel onwards. So 200 years ago, Bristol was leading the way in building a lot of the infrastructure that the country became successful on in the Industrial Revolution. And we now have a lot of the high-tech silicon chip manufacturers and creative agencies that are kind of driving the next wave of digital industry. So, successful and in many ways, there are great things about Bristol. But at the same time, there's a lot of contrast. There's a city of contrast in the sense that although we have a lower unemployment rate than the rest of the country, we do have some real pockets of persistent worklessness. And in some areas, although, like I say, we have 25% of children growing up in poverty, and that's something that's just not acceptable. In certain areas, it's even higher than that. It's around sort of the 50% mark in certain parts of the city. So those are real challenges that the City Council needs to deal with. We have a very fast rise in young people and under 5s, and that puts pressure on school places. It puts pressure on children's services. So there's a whole range of demographic things that we're having to deal with alongside and in contrast to the sort of economic success I was talking about. And then there's a third strand to this, which is that, like all parts of the public sector, Bristol City Council is facing a very significant financial challenge. For Bristol, what that looks like is an £85 million gap in the demand, the costs and the unavoidable demand that we're facing, and the budget, the reductions in funding that come through from government. That £85 million has to come off our operating budget. We've already taken about £55 million out over the last couple of years. So we've gone down from a £400 million a year operating budget down to a much lower budget. So significant challenge in terms of the amount of money we have to spend on the work we have to do. And obviously that means that every pound we spend is critical, and we have to think about how we can focus that money into the parts of the city that need it and people who are vulnerable, and encouraging the growth of the city that's necessary, and not spend it on things that are unnecessary. So alongside that, a fourth thing is that we do still have a very ambitious vision for Bristol, and our mayor, our elected mayor, George Ferguson, set out a vision just over a year ago, which includes a number of key things to tackle long-standing problems in Bristol around transport, around the inequalities in health and well-being that I mentioned earlier. And also we have this, next year we are European Green Capital 2015, and so Bristol has a very strong investment in sustainability and green technology and carbon reduction and so forth around the communities in the city. So a very ambitious programme from the mayor. And so when you put all those things together, it's pretty obvious we're not going to be able to carry on in the same way that we used to operate as an organisation. We can't carry on being a traditional council. Nobody can carry on being a traditional council, to be honest, but with all those things put together in terms of the money going, the demand rising, the ambition, we have to find new ways to operate. So in order to transform the council, we've created a single change programme that's going to construct that council that we need to be. And it goes from a major restructure across the whole organisation, significant reductions in numbers of staff and reshaping of the way that our organisation is constructed, through redesigning many services to the public through using digital technologies and thinking from the outside in about customer needs. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. We have a Bristol Workplace programme, which is about new ways of working in better office accommodation, reducing the number of buildings, and significantly enabling staff to be more agile, more flexible. And again, I'll talk more about that. And underpinning all of that is new ways of dealing with managing process, new ways, new technologies, new application services, and new culture and behaviours and incentives for our workforce. So that single change programme needs a very different approach to IT. So we've created a completely new strategic direction for IT and digital capabilities over the last few years, and we've been sort of driving in this direction for some years now. But this has kind of crystallised over the last year. Fundamentally, open architectures. So we're talking about open data, open standards, and open source where feasible. And that's fundamental because if we're going to completely redesign the services we provide to people and change the way that our functions are constructed inside the organisation, we have to be able to change the systems that sit behind that, the data sources and the way that they operate. And most local government systems were very traditional. They sat behind a specific function like licensing or street cleaning or housing management, and they only really enabled that service. So when you start to think from the customer's perspective and you start to think, well, what's their journey and how can I enable that more effectively, more seamlessly, those silos don't work very well. So open architectures, the ability to integrate and to exchange data in open standards formats, really important. And then when you start to move into that world, you start to need a new set of providers, a new set of suppliers who can support you in that. And we very much have aligned ourselves with central government's desire to increase the number of SMEs working for the public sector. So we've exceeded our 25% target, which is the government set. We think we're around 40% of spend now going to SMEs, and the last 6 procurements that we did went to SMEs. Many of them, in fact, some of them around the Alfresco space. And we also, by doing the work we've done to kind of open up the way we procure and commission services, we've also made it possible for more local businesses to do work for us. So another added bonus in terms of increasing the growth in the city. So the third thing, we've unashamedly stolen this from Government Digital Service. This mantra of digital service is so good that people prefer to use them. So fundamentally, if we want to focus that money that's being reduced and constrained on the people who really need it, then clearly all the people who do take services from us but who can use digital services to self-serve for mainstream kind of services like getting your bin collection, missed bin collection reported, or requesting a garden waste collection, or checking that your council tax has been paid, or setting up a new direct debit for something. All those sorts of things, the things that you would all take for granted pretty much in commercial relationships you have, or relationships with utility companies or what have you, that has to be possible for government as well. So digital service is so good that people prefer to use them is absolutely critical in our strategy. So that's kind of the context, and what I want to do now is move on to speak a bit more about that thought about digital services, because it's actually an important wrapper for where document services come into play. So, first of all, what do we mean? Now, you might all know this, apologies if you do, but it's been quite an important theme in government recently to start talking about digital and not IT. And in some ways, it is just a rebranding. It's just a message that we're trying to get across. But digital, critically, what we're talking about is services that have been designed from the ground up to use internet-enabled technologies. And that's not just at the front end, it's not just a web form. It's actually all the way through being able to use digital services around location, using on mobile devices. It's about being able to use wireless networks. It's about integration of things like social media with traditional channels. And so that whole end-to-end digital services is quite different from the history of putting a web form on the front of a manual process where people were printing things out in the back office. So that's what digital means for us, and if we're going to do that, we're going to need a new infrastructure. So a digital infrastructure has got to have really solid foundations if you're going to rely on it to provide services to, in our case, several 100,000 households across the city and around 400,000 residents. You need the components to be integrated so that when you're talking about joining up services, genuinely that's enabled by the components in the back end also joining up. And you need to be multi-purpose. As I said earlier, you don't want to be operating in these silos anymore. If you decide you're going to completely reshape a function, you need to be able to reshape the tools behind the scenes, so it needs to be multi-purpose. So we've kind of got a high-level architecture. It looks a bit like this. I won't go into detail around this, but we have a bunch of technologies for the digital platform there. We have some technologies that support our contact center, our staff on the telephones. It's all integrated through a services layer to then a number of other building blocks in the back office. And amongst those things, as well as data integration and geographical information, that sort of thing, and the line of business systems that still exist, we have document management. So this is the kind of first positioning of you're going to need sometimes to receive documents. So although you're moving a lot of things to digital front ends and you're using data staying electronic throughout that, you're not creating a document as such, there will be cases where people upload evidence. Or there will be cases where you might generate a document and send that out because people still need some kind of physical channel, some physical evidence maybe, or a letter. And so we want to store those things, and we want to store them in the context of the service, the case that we've created. The other thing that's important to say about digital is that it's not just about technology. It's, as I said earlier, it's about outside-in thinking. Completely reimagining how citizens and visitors and businesses actually experience our services. And that's really important because it changes the way that we think about design. So it's very much trying to understand and doing lots of research on customer experience around how they expect to interact with us. How will it feel? And the fact that it needs to be seamless, it needs to be credible and straightforward. And that it needs to be consistent as well, consistent across all the different services that they experience. So again, that kind of drives towards us needing to be able to use these tools in a sort of flexible, multi-purpose way. And we created a number of design principles, which I won't dwell on, but just to apply to projects, to keep that test going whenever we're doing a piece of work. Are we staying true to that kind of vision? So that was kind of digital services and just pointing towards that role of document management, which I'll come back to in a bit. So then the next main thing I want to talk about is Agile working in Bristol. So like many organisations, in fact many organisations did this 20 years ago, the public sector has been going through this over the last sort of 10 years. And Bristol is about to move from about 20 odd buildings down to 2 main large modern buildings and about 5 locality offices. And we're taking an opportunity to significantly change the way we work. And in the analysis that we've done, we've used the concept of work styles to help us understand the different ways that groups of people in the organisation work. I've just nicked these from the communication materials that have been used to explain to staff, what's changing. So they're not designed for reading by an audience. I apologise. But essentially, we have kind of 4 work styles. So whether you're working pretty much in the office and you're the anchor for the team and you're the person that people go to help find things, or whether you're a kind of analyst type role and you're pretty much resident in a building all the time, but you could be pretty much anywhere in the building. And then people who are mobile, whether they're internally mobile because they're a manager moving between different teams or a project manager wherever they need to be to deliver that project, and then externally mobile field staff. And these work styles, obviously, they are all operating in a slightly new way in comparison to the old offices. The old offices were very fixed. You were in the same office probably for 10 years, the same desk probably, and all of your stuff was around you. These work styles are going to work in a different kind of location. So the kind of settings, this gives you an example just for the internally mobile one, the kind of settings that you're likely to be working in are going to include a whole variety of things around informal meeting spaces, formal meeting rooms, project spaces, breakout rooms, standing tables, all sorts of different things. I mean, many of you will be used to this because it's kind of not new in the world, it's just new for local government. So very few of those spaces involve any paper. There's a little bit of storage for the team, but pretty much moving into new buildings, moving into modern buildings means that we don't want to have to spend the money on paper storage that in the old buildings we used to be in, that we used to be willing to, to accept. So as much space as possible is dedicated to, where people will be, where people will interact, and as little as possible to paper. So it's really not going to be, it's not going to be available to you in your daily work. So as an example, we're moving from a context like the picture above, where people will have racks and racks of filing on their desks, to something like the one below, where really there's nowhere pretty much to put down your paper. In fact, many organisations with these kind of lockers here, they'll put a slopey top on it. I don't know if you've seen that, and they'll put a sloping top on it so you can't put paper down because it'll just fall onto the floor. I don't think we're going that far, but we're certainly driving paper down. And so obviously, people have to be able to find their documents somewhere. So what we've done is, we've clearly introduced Alfresco. Sorry. Yeah?
Have you taken printers out of office?
No, we've reduced them massively though. So from a printer in every office with, say, 30, 40 staff in it, we've now got a printer, or maybe 2 printers per floor with 200 staff in it. And we've shut down colour printing on almost every printer. So, yeah. We've also rolled out laptops. So laptops or tablets to every member of staff who's working in these new environments, which means that when you go to your meeting, when you stand in a breakout space and have a chat with someone, you've got your device with you. So we've obviously then using Alfresco, and we've done we put a number of materials together to explain how document management will work. We're doing workshops with people. We support them through the process of getting their paper. There's a whole project team looking at storage and paper disposals. And so we obviously throwing away as much as we can, putting the remnants off-site as much as possible in boxes. Away they go. They don't need to be looked at very often. It's only the operational documents that might get scanned into Alfresco. But from the point that they move onwards, it's all about keeping the documents electronic, storing them in Alfresco, and managing them and accessing them so you don't need to print them out. So yes, obviously we're sort of selling the benefits of that and the fact that you can also then start moving into things like review and approval cycles and you don't actually need to generate multiple copies of a document through email, that you can just use the sort of tasks in Alfresco. So that's a kind of overview of 2 main themes that both require document services, document management. So I'll now just run through, okay, so what have we actually done with Alfresco in Bristol, and how did it all start? So kind of winding back a bit, Bristol's used open source software for a very long time. And sadly, I've been involved in almost all of that. So 15 years back, we were using all the kind of back-end stuff. Our very first website was a Apache-based website, and we've used Linux as our server infrastructure for pretty much all of that time, mixed with lots of other products too. We had, as many of you might know, a brief flirtation with desktop user software. From 2005 to 2010, we had Star Office and Open Document Format as our standard across the whole organization. And sadly, the rest of the public sector did not follow, so it became far too difficult for us to carry on with that. So we did retreat from that, but at the same time as we retreated from that to Microsoft Office, we were pushing forwards very strongly with a number of other open source products in areas that were less challenging. So Drupal as our main content management system, Alfresco was selected, which I'll talk about a bit more in a moment, along with Effisoft, and then LifeRay, more recently LifeRay as our transactional portal for digital services, and the OpenID suite, which used to be the old Sun identity management product set for citizen identity management and probably in future staff identity management as well. So lots and lots of open source in Bristol, quite a lot of experience and level of comfort. And we've basically followed that government policy that was set out, has been set out repeated times over the years, in fact. And we adopted our own triple open strategy in 2010 around open data, open standards, and open source, and used that to drive our procurement approach. And so whenever we look at a new requirement for some technology to support the business, we would always go and look for open source alternatives as well. And with the advent of G-Cloud, that's become even more straightforward to do, because you can simply go to G-Cloud and search and find many both products and services, but also providers who can support you in doing that. So that's how Bristol has kind of done that over the last few years. So we did do a full-blown evaluation. When we went out to the market, we had a long list, had a lot of the big players on it, had a number of local government specialists on it as well. We shortlisted that down to essentially Microsoft, SharePoint, and Alfresco. Nuxio actually dropped out fairly quickly because they didn't have a records management module, so they kind of withdrew themselves. And we ended up selecting Alfresco based on features and then on some of the non-functionals around open standards. Particularly, we were particularly pleased around the whole CMIS interoperability side of things, and the fact that although Microsoft technically were part of that working group as well, they hadn't actually implemented it fully in SharePoint at that point in time. I don't know if they have now. Whereas Alfresco had got the reference implementation, so there's a level of comfort in knowing that should you wish to leave, you can extract your documents and metadata. And that, of course, ironically makes you less likely to want to leave. So we then implemented that, and we've taken a kind of mixed approach. We've put in an on-premises implementation. We've also then done a cloud pilot, and then more recently, we've put in Alfresco Enterprise as a service as well. And I'll just touch on those three things briefly now. So we put in place a big infrastructure for Alfresco pretty much from day one. Actually, it took quite a long time to put in. And we did that partly because we knew that we wanted to scale up to several thousand, about 5,000 to 6,000 users. And also because we knew we wanted to use it in this manner behind the digital services, so that it was an integrated document application, essentially, so that it was providing those services. And we knew that if we were to then roll that out to potentially thousands of citizens using services, we would need a level of performance in that infrastructure. One of the lessons we learned actually was that that probably wasn't necessary to do that. We probably should have started slightly smaller when we began. But nevertheless, that's what we did. We built a very big and multi-environment infrastructure for Alfresco on premises. And at the time, there were no Alfresco Enterprise services available in the cloud anyway. But whilst building that, people weren't obviously using it as we were building it. So we decided we would start to use the Alfresco cloud service when that launched as a pilot, because people were starting to say, well, can we use Dropbox? Can we use Box? And we wanted to stop that. So we said, well, we've got this thing called Alfresco Cloud, just use that. And that became very, very successful. In fact, so successful, we have hundreds of sites on it now that we are trying to migrate back into the on-premises version, which is, of course, now available. But it was very useful. We used that to actually support our strategic leadership team in their meetings, so that all their papers would be uploaded to that, and they could use iPads to read those in the meetings instead of having to print them off. So that was a successful pilot, and it did allow people to see Alfresco as a tool that they could start to use. They then started to say, well, it doesn't do very much, does it? It's just document sharing, at which point we were able to then start migrating them onto the enterprise version and show them some of the other features. So that was quite useful. And we've done quite a lot since then. So the first point here, I just mentioned the paperless meetings, but that's expanded outwards to cabinet and all our governance bodies, essentially. So my architecture design group and our architecture review board, all the papers go onto Alfresco. The decisions are recorded in a data list. It's a little bit messy, to be honest, but it's not a bad way of recording instantly what your decision was there and then. And all the agendas are on there too. We have our change board that governs the program I mentioned earlier on has an Alfresco site. We have all the meeting papers in there. We have all the additional sort of presentations go in there. The agenda's in there, the forward plan's in there, so it's all managed through Alfresco. And we then obviously have continue to use it behind web services, as I mentioned. So a member of the public will not know that Alfresco is being used when they upload a document. We're currently working on complaints So people will be uploading documents as evidence of their complaint, and they won't know that it's going into Alfresco, obviously, but the staff in the background will be using Alfresco as their user interface. We also, as I mentioned, are using it to support the new work styles. So I've talked about that, I won't dwell on that. And we're also putting it in place in a number of smaller kind of point solutions, like we have a spend control process. Given the financial constraints, clearly you can imagine we need to stop people from buying things that they shouldn't be buying. So we have a spend control process, and it was very manual. It was basically PDFs that people had to print out, fill in, send around through email. Spreadsheets got filled out with the decisions, and they got sent around. So it's pretty manual. It's pretty labor intensive, and we've just recently created an Alfresco site to manage that, and it's now using the document-centric workflow inside Alfresco to move the documents about and automate the majority of the admin in that process. So that's been pretty useful. It's quite a small kind of use case, but it's been remarkably useful to do that. And then I mentioned earlier on that some of the web services staff are just going directly into Alfresco to look at the documents that have been received, but then there are others where we're starting to look at integrating with the CRM. So we've just recently adopted Salesforce as our CRM. We don't do everything with open source. And we are now looking at how, when somebody uploads some evidence, we can actually surface that inside the Salesforce user interface and integrate through the CMIS API to actually get access to the correct folder that's relevant to the case reference that we're working on. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, so we also have an external Alfresco collaboration site. And the main reason for doing this is that when you're collaborating across a number of organizations, they may be public sector organizations, but they might also be voluntary sector or even commercial organizations, obviously, in terms of partners working with us to deliver services. We have to be very careful about what access they have into our internal network. So some of you may have heard of the Public Services Network, PSN, which is the pan-government network, which has a set of minimum security standards, essentially. And one of the key things that's been very strongly enforced over the last year or so has been no unmanaged devices can connect to that network. And what they mean by unmanaged devices is essentially devices that we are able to manage the kind of the security posture of those devices and push data to them or wipe them or do whatever we need to. So if you're working in a voluntary sector organization and you've got a small number of PCs, they might be quite old, who knows what sort of operating system you've got on them, we can't actually let you connect those to our on-premises Alfresco. But we want to collaborate with you, we want to share information, so this is the main reason we've created this Alfresco Enterprise site in the cloud, which is something we did with Zazie, and we're using that then to have this multi-party collaboration sites. Now things may evolve. Some of the things we might look at is how we might evolve that into the future and look at some of the new things that are available through Alfresco 5 now. But at the moment, that's supporting us that way. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about before giving you a chance to ask any questions is obviously we're doing some pretty complex things, and you do run across challenges. So it's just a few things, really. So obviously Alfresco does have good support for open standards, and that's the main reason we chose it. But even though you do have that, it's still pretty tricky in some cases to get it to actually integrate. So when you're trying to integrate, so the Salesforce one's a good example, for instance. We want to make the user experience for our staff as seamless as possible, so that when they're using that particular application, that it doesn't kind of jar with them, that there's something going on in a part of the screen, which is where the documents are being exposed. We also want to make it as seamless as possible when they're creating a document. So if they have to write a letter to send back to somebody who's complained, for instance, how do you make sure that the integration is as seamless as possible? Now, obviously, we saw some stuff in the keynote today, which shows you how straightforward it's going to be. But with the earlier versions of Alfresco, it's not quite as straightforward. And we also have an earlier version of Office than was being used today. So it's not quite as straightforward, and we haven't quite finished the work we need to do around making that user experience seamless. As I say up there, sometimes people start to mutter it would be easier with SharePoint. Sounds like that's all going to go away with the new Alfresco 5, although obviously you've got to upgrade to it. But that's the kind of thing where we've kind of recognised that we need to tackle those challenges and improve things. Another one is that when you commit to something like a kind of open architecture approach, it kind of means you're not just buying single products from one vendor, from one proprietary vendor. That proprietary vendor will probably tell you, don't worry, we'll take all the pain away from you, we'll just do all the integration ourselves and you won't have to worry about it or think about it. So if you step away from that strategy and you do take an open strategy, you've got to do that work. You've got to do that often quite complex work of integrating various technologies together. And sometimes it's actually, that complexity is too great, and you have to ask the question about whether actually it's integrating any one of the components, but in this case Alfresco, actually doesn't really add enough value. There are some cases where the documents that you might store in relation to a particular service are only ever going to be used in that service. Or possibly even they're quite sensitive and you wouldn't want anyone else being able to access them or see them. So it may make sense in some cases to keep those documents outside of the main Alfresco product. And then finally, even though Alfresco's got good support for open standards, there's lots of other systems that don't. So we quite often find that we can get stuff in and out of Alfresco brilliantly, but we can't get it into the other end of the service. So the back office system, if it's really, really closed, sometimes it's just not worth doing it, and you have to accept that the documents are going to stay inside a proprietary system, maybe. So there are compromises and challenges that you have to deal with along the way, and hopefully some of those things will improve, especially with the SharePoint protocol discussion that was had this morning. If that kind of stuff starts happening, some of those proprietary systems that do integrate with SharePoint, we may be able to start cracking some of that stuff. So I'm going to leave it there. I've kind of skimmed over the surface of quite a lot, I know, but I just wanted to give you that broad overview and really ask you, thanks for listening first of all, but ask you if you've got questions. Yeah.
Sorry, I can just give you the microphone so we can hear the question.
For the records management side of things, how visible to the staff do you make that? Do you do it such that they just put documents into locations and don't have to think about it?
So I mean, in all honesty, we haven't started to tackle records management. So we did implement the records management module, and we did that about a year and a half ago, I think. The Bristol Workplace project that I'm talking about has begun to really hit the ground in the last 9 to 12 months. So there was a period of about 6 months after we put the records management in where we just didn't really do anything with it. So we've now started on the document management piece, and really the move into the culture of records management hasn't been tackled yet. We've got to start tackling that as we come out the end of the, as part of that process of moving into new environments, new ways of working. And I think we'll then sort of naturally be able to start talking about, okay, now let's understand how records management plays a role in this as well, the formality of that. So we haven't done that in Angular yet.
Actually, I've got a question before, sorry. I've been in document management for about 25 years, and people have been saying paper's going away over the last 25 years. And if you look at most offices, possibly not Bristol's, there's loads of paper. How did the end users take to this reduction of paper?
I think it's really mixed. I think there are some areas, and to be fair, I haven't been in the depth of the conversations. A colleague of mine's running the project on that, and if he was here, he might give you a completely different answer to this. But I think there are a variety of responses. Obviously, a big organisation, we have lots of different kinds of teams and services. Some of us, my area of the organisation, we're part of the change part of the organisation. So I have enterprise architecture under me. A colleague of mine runs the program management office, and somebody else runs the business process management team. We moved into an office about 2 years ago, which we crammed about 60 people into 30 people's space. And we have a locker each, and we got rid of all our paper. We have lots of post-its on the walls because we do lots of kind of, agile kind of working. But we don't have team paper stores or anything like that anymore. So we've done it, and so for us, it's not really a big challenge. I mean, yes, there is paper. Until the point we've all been given our laptops, we still had to go to meetings, obviously, and although some of us had iPads of our own, people would still print out paper for the meeting, and then they'd walk out the meeting and chuck it in the recycle bin. But now that we've got the laptops, we've all taken to it, really quickly. So there are other teams around the organisation who've been kind of, dying for this opportunity to move like we were. But then I think there are equally teams who have been They sit in rooms at the moment with carousels full of paper files with 20 years worth of contracts or document plans or what have you, and they are probably more challenged by the idea of, probably the most challenging thing is about how on earth am I going to get the time to actually whittle down these papers before I move out of this office? When am I going to get the chance to stop doing my day job and actually decide which things I can throw out? So I think there are teams who are definitely challenged, who will definitely not be happy that they have to do this work in order to get out. But we're forcing it, to be honest. I mean, we're trying to support people, and we're putting teams in to support them and to work with them. So there are floor walkers, there are advisors, all sorts of wrappers around that to help people. But at the end of the day, the new offices, I mean, there isn't a great picture of the whole office, but the new offices just don't have anywhere to put paper. There's a 1 linear metre per person team storage. That's it. So, yeah.
With all the different uses of Alfresco within Bristol City Council, it must have been quite challenging making sure it was secure, yet also ensuring that people had access to what they need to.
Sure.
So how did you define all the access rights and implement them?
That's not easy for me to answer because I'm not working at that level of detail. Now, my colleague Robin Lewis isn't in the room, I don't think. He, I think, is next door with the Oxfam guys. So Robin leads the EDRM practice in Bristol, and he has worked closely with a number of suppliers. Most of our work has been done with Zazie over the last year or two. And he and Zazie or others have worked on this from the very beginning, from the architecture of the systems before we implemented it, through obviously operational implementation of that. So they are the ones who are actually physically figuring out how to make sure that the correct permissions are being put in place and that the correct security roles are in place and so forth. So I'm sure we could probably find Robin later on for a chat during a break, and he might be able to answer that in more detail for you. Yeah. Sorry, there was one here, I think, wasn't there?
Yeah. When you're
and then the back.
A change program, you've got 3 areas you're doing. You're changing the business processes.
Yeah.
You're changing people's behaviours, and then you're changing the infrastructure.
Yeah.
Which of those did you tackle first, and which was the most difficult to tackle?
So I don't think we've tackled any of them first, really. We're doing them in a kind of spiral, in a sense. We're doing them all, some of them at the same time. And because it's such a broad change program, I mean, in reality, there are several programs within the program. The Bristol Workplace Project is actually a program in many ways. It has its own stream of business change focus, which is all about behaviours and culture and trying to work on how people operate, how they think about the way they do work, how they relate to each other. So it has its own strand around that. And that sits alongside the office, the actual physical building changes, and alongside the technology changes. So that's already an integrated piece of work. Across the whole program, we've got in many of the redesign projects that we're doing, we're working directly with the teams who support that service at the same time as we're building the technology. We're using an Agile method in many of those cases, so there's a lot of stakeholder involvement every week in looking at understanding what the user research is telling us. And then obviously that kind of direct interaction with real people as well, real customers, is quite a big lever on people who've maybe been sitting doing something in a very traditional way for a long time. So we're doing a whole mixture of things. We haven't done anything first or second, really. And it's kind of challenging. Sometimes, it'd be nicer to separate things out a bit more and maybe, change the pace a little bit. But because of the challenges that I talked about at the beginning, in terms of the money going and the demand increasing and the ambition, it's almost impossible for us to stop doing anything. And so we have to suck it up, basically, and keep going. And question at the back.
Hi, yeah. I had a kind of question around your how you've dealt with the inbound content from your citizens. Mm-hmm. So obviously a lot of these services you offer have historically always been about form-based. They fill them in, they send them through.
That's right.
So obviously, eventually, the idea is to go towards this self-service portal. Mm-hmm. But along this journey, is there stepping stones you've made of part digitizing that, and how?
There are actually. Do you already know that? Yes, there are. So the first thing we did with Alfresco was 2 years ago. Actually, there were 2 projects pretty much around the same time. So one of them was around our housing repairs staff, who were going out to houses and maybe doing some work on a gas boiler, and then they uploaded a gas safety certificate to Alfresco. So they were using handheld devices and uploading stuff. So that was a staff member using it. The second thing we did was landlords, private landlords who own houses with multiple occupants. You have to license a house with HMO. You have to license one, and there's a whole variety of stuff around fire safety and other things that you have to be checked on. So they have to apply for their license. So that first process, we didn't have our LifeRay portal in place. We hadn't got the sort of digital services and providers that we were working with. So the first thing we did there was we actually used the Adobe Lifecycle product set. We used intelligent PDFs for that, which was fine. It was okay. We didn't have a mechanism to create an account and for people to be able to save partly finished forms at that point in time. So we used the Adobe PDF form creators in Lifecycle to allow us to have a form that could be downloaded and part completed and saved and then finished off and uploaded. So that was a document-centric service. So several thousand landlords that we were interacting with, who would then, they would complete that form and they would upload that through a web service, which would eventually then land that document into Alfresco. So that was a physical PDF that landed into Alfresco. Of course, the XML content was also available, but that document landed in Alfresco. So that was kind of a halfway house. And what we've done since then with the new services we've done, so one of our most recent ones, which just went live a couple of weeks ago, is applying for resident parking permits. And that is a fully digital service. So when you apply online, you're not creating a document as such. It's going straight into the Salesforce CRM at the back end. But when you create the permit, because the permit is still a physical piece of paper that someone puts into the front window of their car, that permit is obviously printed, and that needs to be stored somewhere in reference to the case. So that's actually where we get into this thing about the Salesforce and Alfresco, and can we do the integration effectively? If the Salesforce app was available for Alfresco Enterprise, then we could have used that, but that at the moment is limited to the cloud version. So we're going to be hopefully talking to Alfresco about how we can maybe work together to get that app available for enterprise instances of Alfresco as well, because that would be really useful. But at the moment, that's we're having to sort of work around that, and we'll figure out how to do that over time. Okay, I think we're almost out of time. Is there any?
I think we're out of time, but I'm sure Gavin will be around to take questions.
Yeah.
It does seem wrong, given your approach to a paperless office, but there are printouts of the case at the front. I'm sure you can
It's terrible.
download the website, but I think excellent presentation.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.